This is a breaking news update. This episode you are about to listen to was originally recorded on February 27th, 2026. As of February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel have launched military strikes against Iran, with Iran retaliating with their own strikes. Now more than ever, our security as a nation is of vital importance. I pray for this conflict to end swiftly. God bless us all. Welcome to the Aero Export Consultants podcast. I'm John Young, and this is The Point. If you've been following along with this podcast, you know that we're no stranger to the subject of Iran. Last year, during what was then referred to as the 12-Day War, we did something very similar, taking a look at the current status of sanctions against Iran as a way to fully understand the overall dynamic between ourselves and our adversary in the Middle East. Those of us in industry might be out of our depth when it comes to geopolitical conflicts. I know I am. But we do have influence in our own spheres, and therefore I think it's important that we take a comprehensive approach towards understanding some of these international dynamics, so we can make informed decisions for our own businesses. With that said, I think given our current actions in the Middle East, it is worth taking another look at our current sanctions and export control stance towards Iran. Just to set the stage, as I'm recording this episode, the United States is currently flooding the region with military assets in attempts to pressure Iran into our now ongoing negotiations. In the backdrop of one of the largest force movements into the region since the early 2000s, looms a turbulent Iran, plagued by protests and violence in the past few weeks and months. This is in addition to the ongoing difficult negotiations surrounding energy and nuclear disarmament that the United States is currently spearheading. All in all, this is a powder keg that nobody wants to set off. The latest reporting I've seen was that the negotiations are moving forward and a second meeting is scheduled for next week. But with all of the actions these last few months, we cannot forget that we already have in place against Iran a substantial sanctions and export control policy. In our last refresher on Iran, we took time to examine the government guidance on Iran's UAV-related activities. In this episode, however, I want to take a look at another guidance that was released around the same time, the government's Iran Ballistic Missile Procurement Advisory. Before we jump into the guidance, however, let's quickly review ITAR, EAR, and OFAC trade restrictions towards Iran. Let's start with ITAR. Quote, "It is the policy of the United States to deny licenses and other approvals for exports and imports of defense articles and defense services destined for or originating in certain countries. There is then a list of certain countries, all of which are identified for one of the three following reasons: exports and sales prohibited by the United Nations Security Council sanctions measures, terrorism, or arms embargoes and sanctions. These identifiers are authorized by multiple different U.S. laws, including the Arms Export Control Act, the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, and the Omnibus Diplomatic Security and Anti-Terrorism Act of 1986, just to name a few. The countries on this prohibited list have a policy of denial when it comes to exports, and Iran is on the list. Iran, obviously you might be thinking, can therefore not receive exports for any items covered by the ITAR on the USML. They are embargoed for arms. Now as for the EAR and OFAC, Iran remains embargoed and subject to strict scrutiny. A license from BIS is required to export or re-export most items on the Commerce Control List (CCL) to Iran pursuant to Section 746.7 of the EAR. In addition to BIS license requirements, the Department of the Treasury Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, prohibits unauthorized exports and re-exports to Iran of items subject to the EAR. BIS describes this level of restriction as comprehensive controls and, quote, maintains license requirements and other restrictions on exports and re-exports to Iran. A comprehensive embargo on transactions involving this country is administered by the Department of the Treasury's OFAC. They also make it abundantly clear that even though exports are technically possible for EAR items, they are near impossible. Quote, applications for licenses for humanitarian reasons and for the safety of civil aviation and the safe operation of U.S. origin aircraft will be considered on a case-by-case basis. Licenses for other purposes generally will be denied, end quote. OFAC also has additional guidances under its purview of sanctioning Iran's oil industry. In February 2025, President Trump issued a national security presidential memorandum, which, quote, imposed a policy of maximum pressure on the government of Iran, end quote. The memorandum, quote, directs Treasury to implement a robust and continuous sanctions enforcement campaign to deny the Iranian regime and its terror proxies access to revenue and, in coordination with the Department of State, to drive Iranian oil exports to zero, end quote. In the OFAC guidance issued in April 2025, OFAC gave the following justification. Quote, Iran relies on oil sales revenues to fund its destabilizing activities, including advancing its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs and supporting terrorist groups that threaten the national interests of the United States and its allies and partners. These oil shipments create significant sanctions exposure for maritime industry participants, including but not limited to shipping companies, vessel owners, managers, operators, insurers, port operators, port service providers, and financial institutions. OFAC maintains comprehensive sanctions on Iran and will continue to target Iran's main revenue-generating sectors, in particular its petroleum and petrochemical sectors, under Executive Order 13902 and other sanctions authorities. OFAC will also continue to pursue enforcement actions against those who violate any of its Iran sanctions programs. This is the basic compliance and sanctions scheme that we operate under as businesses in the United States. It should be of no surprise that we have a hostile economic relationship with Iran, given our fraught past and their ongoing efforts to support terror and subvert U.S. laws, and our regulations clearly reflect that. Now that we've gone over the baseline compliance stance towards Iran, I want to circle back to what I mentioned earlier, the Iran Ballistic Missile Procurement Advisory. The advisory was compiled by the Commerce, Justice, State, and Treasury Departments, and is intended to alert persons and businesses globally to Iran's ballistic missile procurement activities. The advisory includes sections on the following subjects: deceptive techniques used by Iranian ballistic missile procurement networks, Iranian ballistic missile-related entities, key goods sought by Iran's missile program, relevant U.S. sanctions and export control authorities, and minimizing sanctions and export control risk. Now I'm going to read through a decent amount of some of these sections and just summarize the others, but let's start with deceptive techniques used by Iranian ballistic missile procurement networks. As the guidance states, quote, Iran seeks foreign-produced goods and technologies that it cannot produce domestically for use in its ballistic missile programs, end quote. As a colossal manufacturer of high-end technology and products, the U.S. is obviously a target for goods and technologies to help bolster Iran's programs. Our sanctions and export controls, therefore, are a barrier to supplying what we would view as a dangerous threat to national security and interests. Iran, therefore, has to seek illicit means and subversion when they acquire U.S.-made products, which we know they are successful in on occasion. There are several deceptive tactics Iran employs when aiming for U.S.-made products that manufacturers such as any listening should be aware of, and the guidance gives the following information. First, obscuring the end user through transaction layering. Iranian procurement agents routinely route shipments, communications, and finances through several layers of companies, brokers, and intermediaries. The layers provide buffering between an unwitting product manufacturer or supplier and the ultimate Iranian missile program end user, and the number of layers can vary by procurement attempt. Communication is also routed through many steps, with brokers associated with front companies and suppliers communicating and entering into transactions directly to avoid involvement of the Iranian missile program end user. Next, falsifying documentation. Shipping documentation, such as bills of lading and shipping invoices, may be falsified by suppliers or front companies at any stage during shipment to conceal shipping routes, embarkation points, consignees, and/or shipping agents. Sensitive items may be mislabeled and marked as general-purpose goods that are widely available commercially to evade notice or extra scrutiny by port or shipping officials. For delivery, entities may consolidate and repackage items for onward shipments to Iran, hiding the true end user from the manufacturers and distributors of the items. Use of third countries for transshipment. Iranian procurement agents will often route shipments through multiple countries prior to onward shipping to Iran. Shipping documentation may list a company in a third country as the ultimate end user. After receiving the consignment of goods, a third-party company will ship directly to Iran or ship through another foreign-based company for subsequent shipment to Iran. And finally, financing schemes. Iranian procurement agents may use deceptive methods to access the international and U.S. financial systems. The entities involved in these schemes range from state-owned entities and financial institutions in Iran to brokers, agents, banking representatives, and even diplomats based in other countries. These entities generally establish and utilize a complex and long-standing network of front and shell companies outside of Iran or use aliases to mask the origin and true purpose of the funds. These entities also use these companies to establish multiple bank accounts in foreign jurisdictions and use the international banking system to generate funds and facilitate transactions that either finance or provide supplies benefiting the regime and its weapons programs. The second overall section of the advisory covers Iranian ballistic missile-related entities, like the ones we spoke about in the previous section. This section contains around 20 end users of concern that exporters should take note of. I won't go through every entity here, so I advise you to look for yourself. If you are indeed in the aerospace industry and are worried about potential weaknesses in your supply chain that might result in Iranian acquisition of your products, definitely take a look. Just know that according to the government, quote, Iran's ballistic missile programs is led by two primary entities, the Aerospace Industries Organization, AIO, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, both of which have been sanctioned by the United States, end quote. So to reiterate, all of the end users listed on the guidance have been designated by one U.S. authority or another and should not receive any U.S. products. Now, if you're wondering if any of this really applies to you because you're not in the aerospace industry, and if you really need to bother protecting the items you manufacture from these sorts of users, the government also provides Section 3 of this guidance, which lists key goods sought by Iran's missile program. The following list of goods identifies a number of U.S. origin and foreign-produced goods sought by Iran for its ballistic missile program. Many of these goods are known to have previously been sought from the United States by Iran. From production and testing equipment, carbon fiber production equipment, carbon fiber filament winding machines, cold flow milling machines, computer numerical control or CNC machines, environmental test chambers, measuring equipment, rate tables. From goods and materials, aluminum tubing, aramid fiber, ball bearings, carbon fiber, cobalt and nickel powder, corrosion-resistant and ultra-high strength steel, epoxy-based adhesives, glass fabric, graphite cylinders, hardener, high-grade aluminum alloy, pressure bolts, resins, seamless steel tubes, thermal insulation, titanium sheets, tungsten-coated graphite, thermowells, tungsten metal powder, tungsten copper alloy plates, X-ray tubes. From electronics, circuit card assemblies, complex programmable logic devices, cryogenic accelerometers, digital signal processors, electrical connectors, D-subconnectors, field programmable gate arrays, flow indicators, flux gate compass modules, inertial sensors, level and temperature transmitters, microcontrollers, pin diode limiters, power amplifiers, power transistors, pressure transducers, thermowells, YIG tuned GAAS FET oscillator, microelectromechanical systems, MEMS components, and from guidance, navigation, and control, accelerometers, gyroscopes, navigational sensors, inertial measurement systems. As you can see, it's not as simple as thinking, I'm not in aerospace, these regulations won't apply to me. If you have any questions about your products and the potential dangers of not following export control regulations, I urge you to contact us here at AEC. The next section of the guidance lists the relevant U.S. sanctions authorities. I won't go into too many details on these, as I'm sure many of you won't find them relevant. I'll just read them out so that you know that these are actually backed up by law somewhere. So number 1, the Iran, North Korea, and Syria Non-Proliferation Act. Missile Sanctions Authorities, Section 73 of the Arms Export Control Act and Section 11B, B1 of the Export Administration Act of 1979B. Executive Order EO 12938, as amended by Executive Order 13094. Executive Order 13382. Executive Order 13949. And Iran Freedom and Counterproliferation Act of 2012. The final section of the guidance is minimizing sanctions and export control risk. Much of what it covers is the background of our current stance on Iran, which I already went over at the beginning of this episode. It ends with detailing some of the various enforcements that have been carried out in the crackdown on Iranian subversion of sanctions and export controls, which are valuable learning tools if you're interested in some of the potential consequences of negligence or intentional ignorance of U.S. laws. But instead of going over all that again, I think it would be valuable to hear the justification for this document and its accompanying information. Here's the government's view on our role as industry in protecting this technology from Iran. Quote, the United States is committed to countering Iran's ballistic missile development and proliferation activities, including related Iranian procurement efforts. We will hold accountable those assisting Iran's ballistic missile program, regardless of the location or nationality of those providing the assistance. Private industry is on the front line of detecting and denying Iran's procurement efforts, and consequently it is critical that companies be familiar with the techniques, entities, goods, and technologies involved in Iran's ballistic missile procurement efforts. Iranian procurement networks are active in many countries, and relevant industries should be keenly aware that foreign inputs are required for Iran's ballistic missile program to support efforts to increase the lethality and accuracy of Iran's ballistic missile systems. End quote. Just to repeat, private industry is on the front line. It's a strange thought because as this episode comes out, we have people in government preparing for the emergence of actual front lines of warfare. Military action is being considered over the very real threat of Iran developing nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles. And we have a vital part to play in this conflict as well, denying arms to one of our enemies. As they develop tactics to acquire U.S. technology despite regulations, we in industry must strengthen our compliance efforts in return to protect our country on all levels. What is our most powerful tool against all the subversion tactics I went over earlier? I say knowledge, knowing the methods illicit actors will use to illegally acquire U.S. technology. Knowledge followed closely by due diligence. And if you need help developing those tools, look no further than us. If you worry about your business's compliance program, if you want to ensure your business remains profitable while being protected, and if you want to understand your role in export compliance, then reach out to us here at AEC. Remember that for all your questions and export compliance needs, contact us here at Aero Export Consultants. Research done right, compliance made simple. I'm John Young, and this has been The Point.